Today we will present the Digital Copenhagen agenda in a whole new format, in a series of online 60-minute talks. 2020 has definitely not been the year any of us have asked for, both on a personal and a private level. And therefore, I'm very, very happy to kick off this series with a very positive message to all of you marketeers, which is about marketing effectiveness in a time of crisis. We have invited two of our top speakers from Digital Copenhagen, Peter Field and Louisa Loran, to give their perspective of the topic. We'll kick off with Peter Field, renowned author and marketing expert, and by many called the godfather of effectiveness. Remember to ask any question in the Q&A session in the Zoom panel, and we'll try to come around those by the end of the session. And now I'll try and hope, cross fingers, that we can move over to Peter from London. Are you with us, Peter?
Thomas, thank you. Thank you very much. I am.
Can you share your screen?
I'm just going to share my screen. Hang on one sec. Here we go. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. If not, I'll press another button. Look, good morning. Thanks for joining me. Now, I'm aware that for many people in marketing, this is likely to be the first full-blown crisis you've seen, maybe your second. And I think there is an assumption out there that we are somehow in completely uncharted territory, and we need to make this up as we go along. But actually, that's not true. We know a lot about how to handle economic downturns, so I'm going to be taking you through a lot of the learning there. And we already know a lot about how this particular crisis is going to play out over time. And the important thing that both I and Louisa are going to talk about is that this is a really important time for marketers. How you are responding now and over the coming months is going to make a huge difference to how your businesses perform in the years ahead. So it's really important that we get this right. But also on a positive note, to echo what Thomas has just said, we tend to look at crises as a time of problem and a time of struggle, but actually it's also a time of opportunity. And I want to talk also about the sense in which this is an opportunity. So if you want to know more about what I'm going to be saying, want to read a little bit more, you can download this report from the B2B Institute at LinkedIn, and my thanks go to LinkedIn for publishing the work that I've done in this area, and others as well. There's a lot of data in there from various sources. But I want to start by just reprising a chart that was actually presented 12 years ago in the middle of the 2008-2009 global financial crisis by Malik Pim's management consultancy, who pulled together a lot of data from almost 4,000 business units around the world that they studied in terms of what the winning business strategies were across a range of different cost areas, in the sense of how those businesses performed in the 2 years that followed. And bear in mind here, they did also look at what happens right now, but they were also and primarily concerned with how those businesses prospered in the years to follow. And that is an absolutely vital lens that we have to look at. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this. It's just to say that they, of course, did identify many areas of business costs where it is very sensible to cut costs as much as you can. Working capital, fixed assets, and so forth. But what they were very clear about was that marketing and marketing-related activities such as R&D and NPD were areas where not only should we not be cutting costs, but if anything, we should be increasing them. Now, you'll see throughout this chart, these are all relative measures relative to what the market is essentially doing. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to increase absolute spend. When markets are shrinking and our competitors are cutting their marketing spend all around us, it doesn't necessarily mean that we cannot find savings, but it is all about relativities. It is all about ensuring that our presence is not suffering relative to the competition. So there are opportunities to save, opportunities to grow, but we have to be very aware of what the rules of the laws of gravity, if you like, are in this market. What's happening now? Well, the following is UK data, but I know for sure that this is happening around Europe and the US at the moment. We're generally seeing some very steep declines, have done, in long-term brand media, TV, radio, outdoor, of course, has been badly affected, down typically around 30%. That is worse than in the global financial crisis of 12 years ago now. Short-term digital media for the first time ever are seeing a reduction in spend, but it is about half as bad as in long-term brand media. Short-term digital media, of course, are all about the now. They're about nudging us to buy now. Long-term brand media is more about longer-term growth. I'll talk more about that in just a second. So what this really means is that what we're seeing is a continuation of the shift to short-term digital activation spend that has been going on since the advent of the big data revolution in around about 2006. That has done enormous damage to effectiveness in general because it has gone way too far. And what happens in recession typically is that that accelerates, and that is certainly happening right now. And this is not a good development for reasons I'll talk about. Now, for the first time, we can add to that the very sensible desire for many businesses to accelerate their digital transformation plans. And that, of course, is a hugely sensible thing to do, particularly in this recession where many consumers are inhibited from making the purchases that they want to. There is a mistake that goes with digital transformation, which is to assume that that means we should pull out of brand building and put our money into what I call digital activation. That is to say, using search, big data tools, display, to drive people to our online presence and make those purchases now. Now, I'm going to challenge that. That is a really big and dangerous mistake. But of course, it is now happening on top of all the usual short-term pressures. Now, this is all despite the fact we had some very clear learning in 2008-9 that the really high-profile recession success case studies were the ones that actually tilted towards brand building. They held their nerve, they held their brand building message and presence, and they were brands like T-Mobile and Heinz and Cadbury and Virgin Atlantic, for instance. All of these had very strong recessions last time round, and my story to you really now here is that you can join that club. It is perfectly possible to be one of those players. Of course, if we are in the travel industry, we have particular and extreme problems, which I'll talk a little bit about as we go through. It doesn't mean we can do nothing. If you look at what, for instance, the Tourism Australia have been doing, and indeed the Qantas airline in conjunction partly with them, just because you have very little money to spend doesn't mean to say you cannot continue to defend your brand. You just have to understand the importance of doing so. Now, why am I going on about brand building? Surely this is no time for brand building. Surely this is a time to take advantage of what we may have done in the past if we have been wise. But that's just not true, and I want to explain why. What many businesses are doing in this recession in an enormous sense is shifting to what I call sales activation. These are short-term messages that try and get us to buy now. They really only work now. They can generate big spikes if we have perhaps a big promotional offer or some interesting piece of news, but their lifespan is measured sometimes in seconds, but is certainly short-term. So if we keep serving these activation messages, the best we can really hope for is standing still. We're not going to drive long-term growth, and we're going to have to keep reserving them simply to stay still, to stand still. It makes very little sense in a recession, particularly because if you look at the contrast with the brand building approach, in which we communicate associations with our brands that prime consumers to want to choose us more and more strongly, those build over time if we keep serving those kinds of messages. They don't only deliver longer term growth in the way that I show in this chart, but they also have another vitally important impact in a recession, which is the defense of pricing power, which always comes under huge pressure in recessions. So it's vitally important to the defense of profitability as the recession develops over time. Now, it's the timing impacts that are so important here, because those short-term sales activation effects really only dominate for the first 6 months, but a typical recession lasts 4 or 5 quarters on the right-hand side of this chart. Now, this recession, we already know we're looking very much at kind of V-shaped. Pandemic recessions are almost always V-shaped. setting aside the fact that Europe is going back into a second lockdown, so it may be a lesser secondary V, but although we go in hard and steep to these recessions, we also come out fast and steep. That we know already. We've seen that when the first wave of restrictions were lifted, there's enormous pent-up demand and people come back fast. So we need to be prepared for that when it comes down the road. If we have only been investing in sales activation, trying to slug it out in a depressed market against all our competitors, we will have seen two things. First of all, that our returns on investment right now will have been falling because our markets have quite probably been depressed. Not true of all categories. In those categories that have been growing, that will be less so. But even so, it still doesn't make much sense to slug it out in a short-term market. What we'll also see if we've gone that route is that we will be doing nothing to ensure we have a good recovery. And that's really what this presentation is all about. Because when it comes to the recovery period, we will have not reinforced our brand will have probably weakened, and our smarter competitors will be having a very nice recovery if they have been investing in brand. That is really what the importance is now. The investments we make now in our brands and in the appeal of our brands to consumers will play out most strongly during the recovery phase that will be coming next year, exactly when nobody quite knows. Certainly the moment we have a viable vaccine in circulation. So it's important we're doing this now. We cannot wait till the recovery period. Media becomes expensive. It's very cheap now, but it will become expensive there, and all our competitors will be piling in there. So it's important we do this now and not wait. Now, I've argued that brand building is important, but it is all about balance. I'm not saying that we should abandon short-term and put all our money into long-term. It is all about balance. And that is what the 60-40 rule is all about, which some of you may have heard of. And the 60-40 rule quite simply says that if you look at the shape of the effectiveness curve, how effectiveness changes as we move from all short-term on the left of this chart to all long-term brand building on the right, we see it is a curve with a maximum, and that maximum is around about at 60% brand building. There was a suggestion in the data that during the last recession, that peak might have shifted slightly more towards 50-50, but for reasons I'll come to in just a second, I don't think that's going to apply this time round. If anything, it might shift more to the right pro-brand. But what businesses are not doing in this recession is making the lesser mistake, which is to go all brand building, which I certainly don't advocate in a recession, because you still need to drive people to make those purchases when you can. But what everyone is doing in this recession, of course, an awful lot of businesses, is going full short term, pulling money out of brand building, as we've seen, and putting what is left into short-term activation. And that's doubly damaging, firstly because it will result over time in a much bigger loss of effectiveness, but also it will allow our brand to weaken and ensure that when recovery comes, we have a bad recovery. And often businesses can take 2 to 5 years to recover from recessions when they make that mistake. The worst thing we can do, of course, is to go completely dark, spend nothing on marketing. And of course, if we do that, and we are not all our competitors are doing that, that is the worst possible case. Brands sometimes never recover from that, but certainly you're looking at up to a 5-year recovery period. So look, it's really important that we continue to invest in brand and we continue to get this balance right. Now, that said, let's just look back at what we can learn from previous recessions. And there are 4 rules that I just want to pull out that we know now very well, and there's enormous amounts of data to support these. The first of those I've already begun to talk about, which is to focus on the long term, because that is really what is going to see us through in the recovery phase, and that is the big opportunity area for us. Now, I said there was some limited sense in a short-term activation shift, perhaps in the last recession, but it really doesn't apply in this one, because in those categories that are depressed in this particular recession, it's often because consumers are physically prevented from buying in them. So what is the point of slugging it out? What is the point of trying to make me fly now when I can't, or I'm too nervous to? Much better to put what limited money you have into defending your brand in those situations for when the recovery comes, so that then I will definitely want to choose you. There are, of course, some exceptional fortunate few, as I refer to them, where maybe there is a sense in shifting more towards a 50-50 balance. And they are the businesses like the one we're using to communicate right now, the Zoom platform, where there is a perhaps short-term window during which businesses like Zoom can gain new customers, but it won't last forever. Look at what's happened since the announcement of the vaccine to Zoom's business and share price. It inevitably took a hammering because people could see the end of the big window of opportunity. So for businesses like that, yes, probably tilt towards activation, but always do both, because brand building boosts what you want to do in the short term. The two work together. It also doesn't make sense because many businesses around the world are already spending less of their budget on 50%, or less of their budget than 50% on brand building. So tilting even further towards activation really makes no sense at all. And we'll talk about one of those in just a second. So it's quite clear that we should be focusing on brand building now, if anything, tilting towards brand building, unless our survival depends on just focusing on our existing customers. And of course, if you're in the travel business in one way or another, I get that and I understand that. You're not going to be able to find big money to invest in long-term growth. It is just a question of hanging on in there. But even so, as I mentioned earlier, there are still low or minimal cost things you can do to keep your brand alive, even if you perhaps can't afford broadcast media to spread that as widely as you would like. So never give up on brand building. Never give up until the receivers arrive, frankly, because it'll always going to be important to the recovery phase. And just to repeat what I said earlier, the real opportunity here, the real case for advertising is not about the now, it's about the recovery. A lot of people say to me, why would I advertise now? Business is down, everyone's in crisis. Well, I've already begun to build the case. I'm going to continue to build it. It is not about the now. Advertising doesn't just work now, particularly brand building advertising. It works for the future and it works for the recovery period. And we have to remember that very clearly. And I just want to talk about something that I know that Louisa is going to talk about as well, which is digital transformation. And of course, this is a really important issue right now. And most businesses are very sensibly addressing this very urgently. But the mistake many businesses make is that because they are moving their business more in a digital direction, becoming more and more of an online brand, that means that brand building is less important. Well, we can look at the data in the IPA data bank and we can compare the importance of brand building versus activation for online versus offline brands. So we already know what digital transformation means for brand building. And very simply what it means is that brand building becomes more important in our communications mix than it does for an offline brand. And there's two reasons behind that, really. Firstly, because activation for a digital brand is easier and cheaper. As more and more business goes online, we can use digital tools to drive that business more strongly in the short term. So we need only spend less on it. But secondly, as we become more and more of a digital brand, we move from perhaps local or regional competition to global competition. These are much more competitive environments in which to sell, and our brand will be a vital aid in doing that. There's another reason as well. A lot of people will say, of course, that why can't I do the brand building using digital media? And of course, there is a huge challenge in all of that as well, which is why we need to keep non-digital media in the mix, even though we are transforming our business digitally. This is research from Professor Karen Nelson-Field in Australia, where she served the same ads on 3 different platforms, TV, YouTube, and Facebook. And she identifies 2 really strong challenges to brand building in those digital platforms. First is that active watching on YouTube is about half of what it is on TV. So we're not really looking at those screens. On Facebook, it is minute, because people really don't like ads served, particularly on their news feeds. It's very difficult to get the attention we need to build brands on digital platforms. And also, as she also points out, the average screen coverage of ads is much lower, 1/3 in the case of YouTube, and around 14% compared to 100% on Facebook. So these are not environments in which it is easy to do the brand building task that we now need to be doing. I'm not saying we shouldn't use them. I'm not saying that it is impossible to build brands on these platforms, but it is much more challenging, and we really need to know what we're doing if we're going to rely on digital platforms to do the brand building piece. That is why we see in the IPA data, and this comes from a study I've just done very recently with Orlando Wood at System 1 and Facebook, looking at how the effectiveness of strongly digitally focused campaigns, these all had major video budgets, and I'm just going to divide them into two parts: those that tended to skew more towards TV on the left and those that tended to skew more towards online video on the right. We're looking at the ability of those two groups of campaigns to build strong brands. And when you do that, you see exactly what Karen Nelson Field has suggested and that I've been arguing about is true, that those brands that put a higher proportion of their money into online video versus traditional TV had lower impacts on their brands. Now, this is a problem that Adidas, of course, confessed to in 2019, and digital transformation was part of their story, part of the reason why they made this mistake. They identified the mistake they made, that they were focusing on the wrong metrics, short-term metrics. And when you do that, it tells a very digitally focused story that we should invest in paid search and online display. But what they found when they did the econometric modeling, that the truth is somewhat different from that, which I'll come back to in just 2 seconds. So this is what Adidas actually did as a result of this very short-term digitally focused perspective. They went 23-77 brand activation. Now, that is enormously different from the 60-40 that my colleague Les Binet and I advocate as being a sensible start point for businesses. Why was that a mistake? Well, their econometric modeling taught them, and this will be very typical for many businesses, particularly for digitally focused, digitally transformed businesses. Econometric modeling taught Adidas that around 65% of their sales were actually driven by brand advertising, not all the short-term stuff they were doing. But you have to have long-term models to see and understand the truth of that. So thinking long-term is really, really important, whether or not we are a digital brand, particularly if we are. Now, I just want to talk briefly about the importance of defending our share of voice, because really what I want to do is to put the opportunity to you, not the defensive strategy. But this is the minimum defensive strategy that all brands should follow. We know there is a very strong relationship between share of voice and stable market share. If we allow our share of voice, our share of advertising expenditure in our category amongst our competitors to drop below our market share, we will see that share of voice fall. And we'll see it fall actually even more quickly during a recession than we would in normal times. I'll come back to that point in just a minute. So allowing share of voice to fall below share of market is likely, very likely, to lead to a loss of market share as the recession and indeed as recovery progresses. But in a sense, that is crazy unless we are in really dire straits, because maintaining share of voice, maintaining our relative balance amongst our competitors is likely to involve less spend, because media is getting cheaper and some of our competitors will be pulling out. So we only need to buy fewer impacts to maintain our share of voice. And those impacts themselves will cost us less, particularly if we're using offline media, which is very cheap at the moment. But think about what happens if we make that mistake and we allow our market share to fall. When it comes to the recovery phase, we are going to be trying to rebuild market share when media are becoming expensive again because all our competitors are piling in. So it's going to be an expensive task, and we'll be trying to do that off a diminished market share and profit base. It's going to be a very, very bloody experience for us. And it's not a place you want to be, believe me. It's a very uncomfortable place to be. So that's the defensive strategy, but I really want to focus you on the opportunity that recessions present to you. And businesses like Procter & Gamble know this very well, which is why they tend to invest positively when it comes to recessionary periods. As I've already argued, the cost of share of voice falls during recession, but in this particular recession, because of the nature of the pandemic, we have elevated usage of certain media by homebound consumers, TV particularly, but also social and some trusted online news channels. They've seen booming audiences. So some of those media have cost less to buy, and they're delivering bigger audiences than they would in normal times. So this gives us an opportunity for lower cost growth than we will ever see in the recovery period and in the years that follow. But also, an interesting finding from the last recession made by two American academics, Tellis and Tellis. When they looked at the data, they conjectured that actually market share responds more strongly to share of voice in a recession than in normal times. It was a conjecture on their part. I'm going to prove it to you in the next few charts. It is actually true. So not only is share of voice cheaper, not only are audiences bigger, but also the bang we get for every buck we put in, for every unit of share of voice, is likely to deliver bigger market share. There are lots of really strong reasons that your CEOs and CFOs need to hear from taking opportunity, taking advantage of a recession to grow and to reinforce our positions. So what I want to do, I'm going to divide the case studies that ran across the last recession, the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. I'm going to divide those case studies into three groups. On the left were the disinvestors. Now, none of these went dark. They would be in an even gloomier category. But these were people who allowed their share of voice to fall below equilibrium. On the right are the opportunists, the ones who saw this as a chance to increase their investment and have positive share of voice greater than share of market. And the ones in the middle are the ones that kind of hang on in there. When you look at market share growth that resulted from those three different investment strategies, you see some very marked differences across the recession, particularly in the recovery phase. So the opportunists saw enormously stronger market share growth than either of the other two groups, with very, very weak growth coming through in the recovery phase for the disinvestors. But bear in mind, none of those went dark. They still maintained some investment, albeit reduced. When you look at profit, you see an even more stark picture where the opportunists saw an enormously profitable recovery. Almost 40% of them reported major profit growth. Now, for that particular metric is an immensely strong result. None of the disinvestors saw any major profit results to talk about. Huge difference. So let me just prove now quickly the Tellis and Tellis conjecture, why this happens, why we get these enormous differences between people who choose to take advantage and those that cut and run and take fright. And the reason is because what we see is an accelerated response to investment in share of voice during recession. So here what I'm going to do is just index the results we get in terms, first of all, of market share growth of those three different investment strategies during a recession versus the 2 years either side of that recession. So each of those investment strategies, does it deliver more strongly in recession versus normal times, or less strongly in recession versus normal times? When you do that, you see that Tellis and Tellis were absolutely right. The positive investment strategy delivers 2/3 more market share growth than it would in normal times, and the disinvestment strategy on the left delivers around half the market share growth it would during normal times, with the ones in the middle coming kind of roughly in the middle. So there is this very strong argument that P&G know very well that these are the times to drive growth. Don't wait for recovery. It's too late then. When we look at the profit response to these different investment strategies, we see a similar picture, but of course, all the results are depressed slightly because in the recessionary period, profits are more difficult to come by, but you see the same pattern. In fact, astonishingly, the opportunists on the right actually saw a greater profit performance in the recessionary periods than they would have seen on the 2 years either side. It actually boosted the profits that they generated, with very gloomy results for those who chose to disinvest. So there's a very, very strong case for investing positively in a recessionary period. Media is cheap, audiences are up, the response to our investments grow. It is certainly not a time to cut and run. Hold your nerve, do not panic. And then quickly, very lastly, I just want to make a point about the kind of advertising we should be running. A lot of people assume that this is a time to panic in every sense. Let's stop running all those ads that we've been running for years that consumers know and love, and do something that we feel is somehow right for this recessionary environment. And it resulted in a lot of really depressing, what I call tumbleweed advertising, just showing how gloomy life was in lockdown. Now, the data I'm going to show you suggests there was really very little reason to do that. But let me just sum up what we're seeing already in this recession from contemporary research, but using the words of a case study written 10 years ago during the last recession, because again, this is a known feature of recessions. This is from T-Mobile, who found during research during the last recession that people's deeper human values come to the fore in recession. As the recession got worse, people were responding in kind by turning to friends and family with warmth and good humor when we might have expected angst and despair. People want warmth, encouragement, positive messages in recessionary periods. They don't want to be reminded of the gloom and doom. And that's really, really important to how we should be advertising. What it argues, and here, this is a chart that I've taken from some really interesting work that the System 1 agency did as we went into lockdown early on in the spring. They just compared the kinds of advertising on the left of this chart that don't tend to provoke emotional responses with the kind of advertising on the right of this chart that do tend to provoke emotional responses. And they looked at the response to those ads before the lockdown and during the lockdown. And what they found was the unemotive ads became less effective as the lockdown progressed, whereas the emotive ads, which are often full of positive stories, these are nice unfolding scenes set in the past, for instance, when people had normal lives. These were the ads that became more effective during recession. So let's not throw away, good advertising that had positive emotional impacts on consumers, because that is really important in recession and downturn. They had another really, really interesting chart, which I think, again, has been widely ignored in this recession, which is the value of continuity. Continuity is important, not just because it enables us to build on what we've done before rather than throwing it all away, but also because it's actually reassuring to people. This is a very simple correlation between the response to ads running before the lockdown and during the lockdown. And the correlation is very strong. What it says is that if your ad performed well before the recession, it's likely to perform very well during this recession and during this lockdown. So don't throw away a lot of good and expensive advertising just because you think that somehow the zeitgeist says we should be throwing it away and doing something different. It was a big mistake for a lot of advertisers. Stick with what you know, stick with what you've done in the past if it's worked for you, particularly if it delivers positive emotional messages. So let me wrap there very quickly. Some very, very simple messages. Don't panic. Don't go short, defend share of voice, but better take advantage of recession, take advantage of cheaper share of voice to drive growth in recovery if you can. Never throw away a good brand campaign. Never ever do it. And remember that emotions work during the recession. And lastly, I haven't really talked about this, but also remember that behaviors are especially important in the recession. We've seen a lot of advertisers claiming to be some kind of superhuman organizations when they weren't, and they got called out and embarrassed for it. So it's important that we behave well as talking the game. I'm going to stop there and hand over to Louisa. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter, for this very, very powerful message to all of our marketeers. Peter will stick around for a short Q&A after the session, so remember to ask all the questions down in the Q&A panel below. Let's move on to our next speaker of the day, Louisa, and welcome to the stage, the M-Talk stage.
Thank you very much.
In Copenhagen. You've had a fascinating career, to say the least. You worked for Diageo, where you learned about brands, customer and insights, data and digital, before moving on to Maersk.
Yes.
Quite a move. You spent 6 years there, transforming this very, very old, renowned company to a digital-led company. And Louisa has recently taken on another bold move, but she's not going to tell us yet, but that's not the topic for today. So take the stage and welcome.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And also a huge thank you to you, Peter. Always inspiring to hear the learnings. And as I've commented on LinkedIn, it's been a trusted source of inspiration throughout my career. So exciting to be standing here with you today. I'm obviously not going to add more data to this because the wealth and breadth of what Peter has shared is plentiful. But I would like to share with you some stories today about how I believe that we should, as marketeers, lead digital transformation and drive organizational change in a volatile world. As Thomas said, I've been proud and privileged to work for some great brands throughout my time. I've worked for big industry-leading brands that were globally needed and globally recognized, but also brands that we've seen in crisis times could also be completely ignored. I've also worked on medium-sized brands that didn't have the scale to drive an industry change, and at the same time were too big to really be nimble. Was it the sweet spot, or were those the ones that would be forgotten in a crisis? And I've also worked on some of those small niche challenger brands that are so exciting, but at the same time could also become the best kept secret. I'm telling you this because I do believe that what I want to share with you today is relevant, irrespective of whether you're in one or the other of these categories. It could be Smirnoff, it could be Maersk, it could be Johnny Walker or Hamburg Süd, or it could be TradeLens, Twill, or a single malt. And I'm sure many of your brands could fit into these categories as well. What is important is that you take ownership and that you're honest about your own position and don't get fooled by and rest on the laurels and really take ownership of your direction, even in a crisis. If we take a look at the logistics brands that I've worked with most recently, I can confidently say that all of these brands throughout the pandemic and any other challenge that they've been faced with have continuously taken responsibility and cut costs. They have also all, with determination, digitized, but they have also all found a way to grow. The biggest of all of these is, of course, Maersk, and it's really exciting to be standing here today, the day where Maersk announced its third quarter results. And I can say they are very, very impressive and something to be proud of. And that was definitely not a given. In 2016, Maersk, as the conglomerate that it was known as then, had a real challenge. And the CEO had to define a new direction. The new direction was set of selling off 25% of the company, 25% that represented an oil and energy business that was no longer relevant for the future of the company. It was a profitable part of the business. So taking a huge risk of removing that chunk and saying you wanted to remain with the remaining part was a brave move. But it was an awareness of making sure that the company was relevant in the future and not leaning on a part of the business that was not believed to be part of that future. So there was the time, it was transport and logistics that was the new direction. And the question then came how to make a bigger company again, because no one likes to give off that 25% and stay there. So we looked to our customers, and as often that's where the answers are to be found. And what was interesting and a very sobering moment was actually to find out that Maersk was their biggest problem. But that also meant that we had an ability and a responsibility to be part of the solution. So in June 2017, we presented a new strategy to the board. It was a very interesting moment because we talked about taking an old-fashioned traditional business, asset-driven, standardized, cost-focused company to become an enabler of our customers' growth, that we wanted to connect and simplify their supply chains and move from just sailing from A to B to actually integrating with our customers more. There was a lot of stares and quiet eyes in that room that day, but there was also a belief that a new direction had to be found. And there was a determination to leverage and reap the benefits of digitization in this process. Exciting time, the board sent the direction, and the strange thing then was less than a week after that, we were hit by a cyber attack. A cyber attack, which in many ways felt like a dress rehearsal for what we're going through now. But I can tell you, when you carry more than a quarter of the world's global trade and you have no laptop that works and you have no phone that works, it's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. There was a high risk of people going into panic. But once again, they took the step back and took a perspective of saying, how can we manage this? I can tell you, with the strategy, the new strategy being only a week old, or the sign off of it only being a week old, of course, there was a huge risk that this would stop and derail it, because the fundamentals of digitizing a company, when it was staring you in the eye, what the risk of digitization also was, or the fact that we wanted to become integrated part of our customer supply chain, when we realized then and there how big an impact we had. But fortunately, I would say, Maersk continued on this journey. And today, through the pandemic, it has truly shown that taking this greater responsibility made Maersk more relevant today and will do so in the future. What we see is that today, imagine if Maersk had been an ocean carrier, and during the crisis, all we could have done was delivered cargo from one port to another port. Goods would just have piled up. But because we were able to set the new direction then and work hard to digitize our company, we've actually been able to find solutions with our customers throughout this. There are many more learnings about that. And as said, it was a dress rehearsal from handling the pandemic. And even though I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, it helped us a lot when we had to manage during the crisis. But enough about that phase. What I think is relevant now is to talk to you a little bit about how we drove that transformation. This is probably it's definitely an oversimplified slide and an ugly one too, but just taking you through a couple of the steps on the commercial transformation journey that we had to go through. First, we set the strategy, we defined which products would be relevant, which value propositions. We started to talk about which capabilities and how we needed to be organized. And interestingly enough, for a lot of people, this is only when the penny dropped that we were actually changing. At this point, we also started to change the customer experience in our front-end digital development and repositioning the brand, going out there and saying to the world, hey, we want to be someone different. At this stage was also where we had to make some of those clear choices of which channels were we to engage with our customers in, which customers could we actually have a digital engagement with, a fruitful and valuable one, not just a cost-saving one, but one where we were able to serve them relevant content and relevant messages and features throughout their journey. And for whom was that completely not the way to go? This was also the stage where we were able to have so much of our house in order and at the same time be able to say which platforms could we be present on and where could this help us give more reach. And at the same time, a point where we had to climb some really big mountains of fixing our own back-end systems. We've not regretted taking the front end first, but reality is that the mountain we had to climb there is not to be underestimated. And the reason I put the data one in red is because that is one that we should have fixed earlier on. We found ourselves in situations, unfortunately, where because we didn't have a clear data ontology, we actually needed to break down some silos as we found ourselves competing across the organization. And where nothing is in the bag yet, I'm proud to say that we are really at the stage now where it's about scaling and rolling these learnings out for further delivery. And just one example more to tell you from a younger sister, if I can call it that, within the Maersk family, which we then did a couple of years later and have compressed. What is interesting to share about this is in a digitized transformation journey, we learned to take the experiences that were closer to the customer earlier in this journey. You can see how front-end development, how brand repositioning, they are earlier in the phase, and we only later have been developing the products and the value propositions. So getting closer to our customers in this phase and learning how to use them in the development process has been hugely valuable for us. So hindsight is a great thing, right? You can definitely say that some of these things only made sense as we put the puzzle together and the learning through it. Because I can promise you throughout this journey, there have been times where you didn't know whether we were going up and down. But as Peter was talking about, having an eye on the long-term ambition and knowing how to make yourself relevant in the future is really what drove it. A couple of points to share with you to maybe give you confidence and resilience in your transformation journeys is also to talk about how we've managed this as marketeers. One example is that we in 2015 wanted to do some digital marketing. At this point in time, it was completely new to Maersk. We had not been on any of the platforms that one should be, etc. And I did my traditional business case and got $500,000 to prove the case. What I was very clear on was I'm not going to necessarily return $500,000 in profit to the company, but I will definitely return $500,000 in learnings. Rightfully so, we got a lot of learnings and we didn't make as much money on it as we wanted. But equally then I was responsible enough to the subsequent years, as I got my budgets and they continuously increased, I was always the first one to give back the money. I was always a step ahead of the CFO coming to me and asking for cuts because I did my due diligence and understood whether it was actually a relevant investment or not. Another story to tell is, of course, how we've transitioned and how this has been captured by our customers. It is incredibly old-fashioned to talk about Net Promoter Score, I know that. But I've also learned that sometimes the perfect answer is not the way forward. So after spending a year probably trying to get my head around how a CFO could remember 60 different numbers in a P&L calculation, but only one NPS number, I gave up on that. And for years, that was what we tracked. And we managed to actually move our NPS from -20 to +22 over a 4-year period and have throughout 2020 maintained it stable. And only once the organization had gotten that on board, we started to build upon that. We started to build with more satisfaction numbers, more econometric modeling, and try to use this also as an organizational tool. For instance, looking at satisfaction across the various parts of the customer journey, not to prove that point, but to break down silos and ensure that the organization lifted together and understood that it was a handing of a baton on a customer experience. So lots of good stories to tell, and I will now move on to 3 slides that I think are some of the ones that have crystallized what I think is most important at these points in time. This slide is actually taken from a safety briefing because at Maersk before, we have, of course, a huge responsibility to protect the safety of employees and partners all around. And for years, we had been tracking the numbers of incidents. It had been going down, but it was plateauing, and we were not able to actually break through this until we took a new approach to safety. It was not about measuring the output in this case. It was about understanding why did things happen. So if you look at this quite simple graph, you can see the green line. That's what you present to the boards. That's what's shiny, and that's where you think everything's fine. But then reality hits. It could be a pandemic, or it could just be a bad day, or anything that could challenge you, a bad meeting moving into the next one. And I think what we need to be honest about is where are we right now? We need to anticipate, respond, monitor, and learn so we can continuously adapt to make sure that we do not get into crisis mode. Because crisis mode is not where the best decisions are being made. And this is also a chart that I've used quite a lot with my own teams. They know it well. And the reason I use this is actually because as a leader, the main responsibility is to put together the puzzle of information and continue to set the direction for the company. But it is also a risk of raising things to the highest level of incompetence. The marketeers who sit with the budgets and understand what dynamics are influencing their spend need to take responsibility to surface the right metrics, to take what Peter just talked about and give the right perspective so that is raised to the executives in a distilled, clear manner so they can make the right decisions. This is, of course, true for every single employee or person around the world. But one thing I want to also finish with is, especially for marketeers, I believe marketeers have a unique position to help through a crisis. Marketeers by default have both a creative side and an analytical side. And this is really what's required at this point in time. Peter was talking about it as well, how right now people need a sense of encouragement, a trusted partner, someone who can lean on and someone who can alleviate fears. And that's really that right side of the brain. but they also need the confidence of the data. Someone else has done it before. How can we get past it? How can I, with no clear path forward, gain some confidence from others? So as a marketeer, do not be silenced and only talk to one side of these two, because you have a unique ability to help steer your organizations through a crisis. So in closing, if you haven't guessed it, my big advice to you is to hopefully learn from my stories and have perspective. Look honestly at the fundamentals and build your path from where your core is today to your future relevance. It may be exactly the same, or it may require you to take some bold moves, but you are responsible for taking that. We all live in a digital world, but as Peter was saying, that does not mean that everything has to be digital. But many of us were not born in the last 15 years, and therefore my advice is to consider everything with a digital lens, but don't do anything with a digital lens. Be very clear where it is more effective, either because it's been proven or because it's more of a human engagement, not to do it, and be confident in those choices. Remember to fuel both sides of your brain, and remember that your audience may not have that same skilled both sides of the brain. So engage them with simplicity, but convince them with, or give confidence with detail. Speak the language of them, but rest with confidence that you have something unique to bring. And again, life is progressing. There are lots of things that are changing, and so should you. As you can see with Maersk, we've been very, very proud of learning from the best. We have gained inspiration from many different industries, and that's really the only way that you can keep ahead in these times. So my last point is, this is not necessarily easy, but it's incredibly exciting, and do not neglect to lead the way as marketeers, because you have a unique ability.
Thank you so much, Louisa. And of course, coming from the Danish Marketing Association, I strongly believe that that's a powerful message to all of you marketeers out there. And just coming back to that, and Peter will join us for this Q&A as well. Peter talked about staying on brand and continuing investments and continuity as marketeers in these times of crisis. But I've been on the other side personally. I know it's difficult when there's a crisis as a CMO or marketeer to come up to your CFO and argue that you should continue doing what you have done. Could you just elaborate a bit more on how you could or should approach that? And Peter, feel free to join in as well here.
So if I kick us off here, my approach would actually be to leverage your skills of customer insights. So if you, for instance, are at the point where you have not been ahead and you have managed your budget yourself and proposed whatever adjustments should be made, I would try to understand what is behind this question. Is it someone who has been told to do so, in which case that's the parameter you need to move behind? Is it someone who is afraid of what pressures he's being left with? Is it a media story you're looking for? It could be tons of different things. Do not just take the simple question for face value, but try to understand what drives it, what that leader is driven by, and offer alternative solutions. Surface the relevant information to his iceberg.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean,
Peter?
certainly, I think the problem that I think we face here is that a lot of the correct actions to take are in some ways non-intuitive. A lot about marketing is not necessarily intuitive to someone who doesn't have a marketing background. And CFOs and CEOs very, very rarely have any kind of marketing background. They're obviously very bright people, but unless you understand the way marketing works, you won't automatically intuitively understand the best way to handle these kind of crises. So we see in lots and lots of companies where quite clearly the CFO is calling the shots. You know, the CFO has not been persuaded. The CFO has not been, if you like, educated that to see this as perhaps a time of opportunity or a time to hold on nerve. And they simply see marketing as an area to slash costs, because there is, they would see no cost to doing that. So why not do it? So you really, this is the time I think where marketers more than any other are going to earn their salaries, because you've absolutely got to challenge what will seem very sensible to someone from a finance background, but in fact is lethally dangerous behavior. And the only way you're going to do that is with an evidence-based point of view, left and right brain, as Louisa said earlier. You've got to give them the sense of excitement and opportunity, but you've also given them the hard data that says this is the way we should proceed. And I think that's always the way in dealing with CFOs. You've got to, you've got to give them the data, and they won't buy it otherwise.
I believe you called this recession a recession on steroids once. So is this actually an opportunity for marketeers to seize the moment and to be even more bold than in a normal time?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think it is. I mean, particularly because it's a recession on steroids in two senses. One, it was particularly deep. We went in really deep and hard, particularly in the UK. But we've already seen the moment the restrictions are released, the recovery phase of this kind of recession is extraordinarily rapid. In the matter of weeks, markets can turn and pick up again. And we're going to see that. I absolutely promise you, the moment people are free to travel, the airlines of this world are going to be absolutely full of business. We already know that. The day that the first results of vaccine trials were released, EasyJet, for instance, sales picked up 50%. Now, we kind of know the way it's going to go. We know it's going to be a very, very rapid response to recession, recovery from recession. So, we need to be doubly prepared. All of the learning is on steroids. Everything applies doubly. We've got to anticipate more strongly. We've got to be ready for recovery more strongly. And all the things that Louisa's been talking about, having a plan, knowing where we want to get, being able to think it through. We've got to do that groundwork now. It's too late just to respond to events. We've got to anticipate them and plan for them, I think.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, this is a time where it's so easy to become wallpaper. And if you do not know who you are and stand forward and communicate that with conviction, how should people trust you in a time where everything is unpredictable? So if you stand clear with your direction, you're actually giving them a safe place to come to and spend their money. Well
spoken. Actually, we have a question from our audience, and it's somewhat related to the fact that the argument being that in a time of crisis like this, we should definitely try and be more present and overinvest. But isn't there some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in that it's the companies that already do good can do better when overinvesting? That's a question from the audience.
Yeah, and of course there is a grain of truth in that. There is, to some extent, in recessions, the strong tend to get stronger and the weak tend to get weaker, and there's no doubt about that. If you have been smart enough to having been investing behind your brand for the last decade, then you are probably going to find it easier to navigate the rapids of this recession and come out still floating. But that doesn't mean that we have to be completely fatalist about this. The great thing about the kind of share of voice model is that it is all relative. And even if we're a small brand with a weak position, so long as we hold our nerve and so long as we invest in line with our presence in the market, we should still be able to defend or perhaps even grow our position in that market. It doesn't have to mean that only the big guys win, and it certainly needn't do. I mean, there's a brand, an insurance brand in Australia I was reading about the other day, NRMA. They're successful, but not a dominant brand in the Australian marketplace. They have decided to up their marketing budget by 65% right now because they see this as an opportunity. And the CMO of that particular organization has got a track record for punching hard and coming out as a winner. And I'm totally confident he's going to do it. He's carried his board with him. He's got their confidence. He's got the data. He's got the arguments. And by Christ, am I going to be watching how that company succeeds during this lockdown.
We'll definitely be rooting for him as well, here from Denmark as well. I think we'll need to wrap up this, but I know a lot of us, especially marketeers, are pretty tired of this Corona stuff. So could you give just one final piece of advice for all of those who are eager to come back and do some creative marketing?
One piece of advice. Well, for those who are tired, I would say sleep. I'm kind of joking, but someone very wise once said to me, if in doubt of whether to do an extra round on the presentation or sleep, always sleep, because with a smart mind, you can manage everything significantly better. So look at yourself, find out where you are, put your own oxygen mask on before you help others, but your brands are counting on you. So take responsibility.
I mean, this is the first time we've heard the word creativity. I mentioned, and I absolutely echo it. This is the time for great creativity. You know, it delivers more powerful results in all times. Now is the time you need creativity more than anything else. So be brave. This is the time to find the courage to make creative strides.
And limitations unleash creativity as well. Remember
absolutely, that. Absolutely. But you know, do it in a sense that is consistent with the investments you've made in the past. Don't throw everything away on wild, undisciplined creativity. Let's make it sensible, strategic creativity. But yeah, please do it. Please do it.
Okay, and ending up on that positive note, I'll just wrap up this first premiere of M-Talk. And next week, we'll tune in to M-Talk edition, where we focused on e-commerce in a pandemic era. So we even have a case from China. That's pretty interesting. So tune in next week. Thank you.